Morning. Good morning. Sorry for the slight delay. What's called a technical problem, but we're ready to take off now and start the program. My name is Bruce Kogut. I am the co-director of the Sanford C. Bernstein and Company Center for Leadership and Ethics. My other co-director is Sandra Navali, who many of you know. We also work with a team consisting of Anna Berger and Carolyn Tharp, who are here today. I wanted to thank them ahead of time because occasionally we forget our thanks at the end. So thank you very much to these people. And also Beth Devine from the program for on social intelligence. So thank you so much for putting together this program. We are very happy to have an interesting program in front of us today. What my center does, very briefly, is responsible for research on ethics and leadership and governance, and also responsible for the teaching of it as well. So we teach these subjects throughout the MBA, EMBA curriculum, and we teach this in an intensive orientation program, among other things. There's another program which I'll let my colleague Michael Morris maybe say a few words about if he wishes, on social intelligence, which is aimed primarily for the students, though I know the primary needy group of the whole place is the faculty, of course, which we all know that. And also very happy to work with Malia Mason on this program. So it's been a very nice opportunity for us to work for the first time together on something we truly think is quite important. On the issue of ethics, there's one view that you don't do bad things and you slap hands for it, and we believe in that too, occasionally going to jail for things as well. Probably a more controversial view of this thing is actually that doing good things to improve the world is helpful for the formation of good ethical values. I mean, it sounds simple to us, but it's not always held to be the case. So last year we ran a program, which I know many of you saw on the back, on universities, careers, and women, led particularly by Claudia Golden from Harvard, which was a great discussion for us, and it was filled with a lot of data, which many of you may interest you, on the career prospects of women in the workforce, among other affected groups. We think this is important because this is an area which is clearly an inequality in the world, and the belief is we should address these issues, but also have the theory, and I say this to you as an audience filled with many psychologists, with the belief also that doing so has a positive impact upon the value formation of our community. And this is why we engage in this very strongly. So I was really delighted to come into a school such as Columbia. I've only been here 2 years, which has such a strong representation of psychology in the department, and to see the work which they have been doing, which is really quite impressive. And the idea was through conversations to do something more on the areas of the really great research being done in psychology now across many fields, but also in the areas of stereotypes, some of the new techniques of brain imaging which is coming into place, and have a chance and opportunity to discuss these issues. And the outcome of this will be not only a video which will be displayed publicly, but also a brochure which will be drawn up too, which you've seen done in the past, because we think that every program we run is not just an ephemeral moment for us, but should have some trace, some lasting document, which can be used for discussion going out in the future. Thank you very much to all the speakers who came. Thank you very much to Susan Fisk for making that long trek from Princeton to New York. I look forward to today very much. For me, this is a great opportunity to consume and be part of an intellectual dialogue, and it's going to be a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce. My name is Malia Mason, and I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker, Princeton's Eugene Higgins Professor of Psychology, Susan Fisk. Most scientists build careers by filling in the details of existing theories or applying them to yet another context. Fisk, by contrast, is one of the few that conceives them. In 1990, Fisk proposed the continuum model of impression formation, which describes the conditions under which people think of others in terms of their individuating attributes, loves barbecues, bulldogs, and Brussels sprouts, for example, instead of the social groups to which they belong, female, Caucasian, or middle-aged. Now, I'm no dinosaur, but I've been around long enough to know that it's the rare scientist who generates models of theories for anything. Few have the diligence, creativity, intelligence, or courage to even attempt predictions about how social phenomena will unfold. Fisk has not one, but multiple deeply entrenched theories. The aforementioned continuum model, the ambivalent sexism theory, her theory of power, and the stereotype content model. The respect the field has for Susan Fisk is apparent in the enthusiasm with which it has incorporated her conceptual terms into the shared scientific dialogue. She coined the phrase, "thinking is for doing," to capture the idea that people selectively construct their world for the sake of whatever it is they're trying to accomplish. While she was a graduate student, she captured the human tendency to rely on mental shortcuts with the term cognitive miser. The scientific community speaks through her insights. I'm going to go out on a limb here, however, and suggest that what really distinguishes Susan from other notable scholars is her commitment to social justice. Her research and expert testimonies in discrimination suits involving United Airlines, Home Depot, Merrill Lynch, and several other companies have helped establish legal precedents. She's considered a pioneer of the field of social cognition. She is one of the first researchers to study the biological basis of social thinking or social neuroscience. She has authored 200 research articles. That's an average of 6 a year for those of you who forgot your calculators, and written 6 books. Ladies and gentlemen, Susan Fisk is not on the all-star team. She's a Hall of Famer. Please join me in welcoming Susan Fisk.
Now we see whether the Hall of Famer can work it. I have a leaderboard. Oh, is that on now? Yes, okay. Well, after an introduction like that, I sort of feel like I should just sort of pack up and slink home. But I'm particularly excited to be speaking here today because I think that there will be a lot of connections to be made to the world of business and to those of you who like to think deeply about issues of inclusiveness in that setting. And I have to say that my own work has been very much informed by the expert testimony that I did, that Malia mentioned, because it got me into reading people's descriptions of what the business world is like on the ground. And it revealed some of the shortcomings in what social psychologists do, because many of us have gone into the field hoping to make the world a better place, but if you don't know what's going on in the world, how can you do that? So what I'm going to be talking about today is a kind of brief smorgasbord of some of the kinds of work that we're doing, but I'm framing it in terms of the stereotype content model. So there are only 2 kinds of people in the world. People who are your friend and people who are not. The sentry in the middle of the night calls out, "Halt, who goes there, friend or foe?" That's the first thing you have to know. And in New York, in a dark alley, or at a conference, even you meet somebody the first time, you want to know, is this person going to be cooperative or competitive? If the person is friendly, they're also and on your side, then they're part of the solution, not part of the problem, and you infer that the person is warm, friendly, trustworthy, and sincere. Well, okay, maybe not just 2, maybe 4 kinds of people. Besides deciding if the person is on your side or not, which is basically a decision about what are the person's intentions toward you, are they good or ill, you need to know whether the person can act on those intentions. because if the person has ill intentions but can't do anything, it doesn't matter quite as much. But if the person is able to act on their intentions, then they're seen as being competent and skillful and so on. Well, I'm a social psychologist. We like 2x2s, and this is our favorite 2x2. It turns out that this simple design gives you a lot, for me, I mean, not to toot my own horn, because other people have thought of these two dimensions, and I can give you a list this long of people who've thought of related things, which is comforting because it means we didn't just make it up. But it turns out to give you a lot of practical handle on inclusiveness and issues of managing diversity. Dilbert, of course, understood it first. He didn't quite get the, oops, oh, that didn't work, okay. Well, anyway, he didn't quite get the 2x2 right, but it's more or less the right idea. So we talk about, in our work, we talk about prejudice as plural, because people are used to thinking about bias as being something like, I hate them. Well, it's not just that. It is that, importantly, but not just that. And it turns out that looking at the qualities of bias helps you to cope with dealing with it. So what I'll be arguing is that the biases come in distinct types. These types come from society and stereotypes that people have in their minds. We have found them universally across all the cultures that we've looked at in similar patterns. They happen at the level of the individual, and if we're arguing that they're relatively universal, then there ought to be neural signatures for them, and we're starting on this project now. And they matter because they result in different kinds of discrimination. So, you know, as managers or advising managers or training managers, people need to know that not all discrimination is the same, and that'll be the end of the talk. So, we mentioned friend or foe, able or unable, and this warmth by competence space. So previous work within social psychology and sociology and so on has focused really on pure antipathy. Oops, oh, wrong button. Okay. Pure antipathy and pure favoritism. And what this model buys you are the other two cells of this 2x2, that is ambivalence. There are groups that people think of as being outgroups, but that are perceived to be okay on one dimension and not okay on the other dimension. And this ambivalence creates a really interesting and important set of understandings about prejudice and how it operates. So let me give you some examples, and I think it'll be intuitively, immediately clear. The groups that are seen as having no redeeming features at all are people who are low on warmth and low on competence. It turns out that poor people all over the world are seen this way. People on welfare, homeless people, and the emotion that's associated with this combination is disgust, really, and contempt. There, you know, sometimes there can be pity too, but it's the only groups that elicit disgust. In direct contrast to them are us. We're good. We feel good about ourselves. We're nice. We're smart. And also the societal reference groups, the middle class, for example, would be an example of this. And they elicit pride, even from people who are not part of that group. If you go over to the groups who are seen as warm, but not so swift, older people all over the world are seen this way. And I was hoping to find some place where older people were respected, but we haven't found that yet. And people with disabilities, either mental or physical. And these people elicit pity, which, if you think about it for a minute, it's a mixed emotion, right? It says, it's paternalistic. I feel sorry for you as long as you're below me and you can't do anything. But as soon as you start being effective, then you don't get pitied anymore. So, and nobody wants to be the object of pity, so it's not a very positive emotion. And then the other cell includes rich people all over the world, probably business school professors and graduates, And in ethnic terms in the United States, people who are Jewish or Asian also often fall into this combination of being seen as highly competent but not a warm, fuzzy human being. Okay? That somehow they got so successful because they elbowed their way to the top. Professional women, I can tell you, are in this category too. Okay, so envy, by the way, is also a mixed emotion. It says, you have something I want, and I'd like to take it from you if I get a chance. Okay, so basically, how do we do this research? In the surveys, we ask people about the particular societies, opinions of groups. People report what the society thinks. And we use common groups that another group of people from that society have nominated, so we're not just stacking the deck with our particular groups that fit our particular space. And we ask people to rate these groups on some combination of warmth and competence, and then social structure, emotions, and behavior, depending on the study, which I'll explain later on. Okay, so here's an example of a representative sample survey. And here's where I wish I really knew how to work this pen. Help. Just right on the screen. Okay, well, we'll try. No, it's not working. Well, see, it's making it change. Okay. Can you turn it on? Sure. This is why I don't teach at a business school. Very sophisticated. Okay. So if you start here, what you see are, Americans, middle-class people, in particular as reference groups. Some of the other ones we can talk about if you get interested in the Q&A. Down here we have poor blacks, also poor whites end up here, people on welfare. Notice that homeless people are 3 standard deviations from the center of the space. This will turn out to be important. And this is a cluster analysis, by the way. And you can see old people are up here and rich people are down here. The emotions that these groups elicit are indicated here. I'm not giving you the means, but basically these groups elicit that emotion more than any of the other groups do. Now, part of the utility of this is that it helps you to understand social issues. So, for example, Tan Lee, who's sitting over there, and I looked at people's perceptions of immigrants. And it turns out that it really helps you to understand what's going on in the whole immigrant debate. Notice that undocumented people are down here next to the homeless people, right? If you get documented, you're okay, right? Same person, documents, no documents. Notice also that the people who are down here are Mexicans and Africans and farm workers. So you can see when people are getting agitated about immigrants, these are the people they're getting agitated about, right? On the other hand, if you look at Asian immigrants, they're in with professionals and tech industry people and rich people, right? So when people are talking about immigrants, they're not talking typically about Asian immigrants, right? Because they don't get agitated in that particular way about Asian immigrants. They get agitated in other ways, which we can talk about. And they're certainly not talking about Italian and Irish immigrants who are seen as pretty nice and warm, and they run, pubs and pizza joints, and so they're okay. The other interesting thing about this graph for the moment is you see that Americans are here, but Canadians are even better than we are. So I'm not Canadian, but I have to admit that they have a better reputation than we do. Okay, so basically we've got a hammer and we're hammering everything with it, and it turns out that it does a pretty good job. It's simple, it can be used for a bunch of things, and it gets the job done. So if these work so well, where are they coming from? Well, it turns out that there are principles that predict where these 2 dimensions are coming from. If these 2 dimensions are so universal, it turns out that when you tell people that somebody's high status, they jump to the conclusion that the person deserves it. If you tell them they're low status, they jump to the conclusion that the person deserves that too. It's a real meritocracy theory. It's basically a fundamental attribution error, right? Assuming that the person is in the place they are because of their personality, not because of their situation. And then in terms of the warmth dimension, it's predicted completely by what I implied in my opening description of the theory, which is that it's like the playground, you know. If you're playing nicely with me, if you're cooperating with me, then I like you and you're a good person. And if you're competing with me, then I don't like you and you're not a good person. So we set out to test this, and across a whole bunch of different studies, the status-competence correlation is staggering, I would say. You know, we don't often get 0.77 correlations in social science. In fact, it makes you nervous because maybe it's just a reliability. But it's not just a reliability, because we ask people, do these folks have prestigious jobs, and are they successful and have a lot of money, economically successful? And on the other hand, we ask, are they intelligent, are they capable? Well, those aren't the same thing, but people, and it's not just a halo effect, because you can see the status effects on warmth are trivial. For the competition effect, the effects are there. They're not quite as striking, but they're still there. And they range a bit across samples. But you know, in the vast majority of samples, this correlation is also significant. I think we're not totally measuring competition and cooperation as well as we could, because otherwise I think it would be higher. But you can see that it's way higher between the relationship, as compared to the relationship between competition and competence. So these are correlational data from a variety of samples around the world. We've also looked at the causality issue, that is, if you manipulate perceived status and you manipulate perceived competition, do you get competence from the one and warmth from the other? And so in little vignette studies that Peter Capariello and Amy Cuddy and I did, we found, in fact, that high status, the orange, leads to high competence inferences, and that high competition leads to lower warmth. Those are the green ones, right? So this is a demonstration that it can happen this way. The causality can operate in the direction of social structure to traits. People also make the reverse inference, by the way, but it's not as robust. Okay, so basically what we're saying is that people end up with these stereotypes. Groups get these stereotypes kind of by accident of where they end up in the social system, which I would argue is in the United States especially, is by accident of immigration histories. Who happens to come and under what circumstances at what time? But our basic argument is that these two dimensions are fairly universal, and if they're universal, we ought to be seeing them across cultures. And early on, Thomas Eckes did a stereotype content model study in Germany, and it's practically identical to the American samples. You can see that you know, the disabled are up here, and welfare recipients are down here, and the generic immigrant is down here, and you know, feminists and millionaires and career women and managers. What can I say? This was a group of West Germans who were doing this, so they saw themselves as, you know, pretty darn good on all dimensions. They didn't think the East Germans were so great. But what we found is that when groups like black people end up in the middle, if you break them down into subtypes, for example, in the United States by social class, then you may have noticed on the one of the previous slides that rich black people end up here, or actually they end up here, and poor black people end up over here. So groups can be in the middle either because people go, I don't know anything about this group, or they can be in the middle because people have mixed stereotypes about them and they average to this thing in the middle, which, anyway, so. This is also something that appears to be useful over time. Hilary Burke, who's sitting over there, worked with me and a couple of Princeton senior thesis students on comparing perceptions of groups in 1932 from the famous Katz and Braley very first study of stereotyping and more recently. And part of what's interesting about this is that Turks, I don't know what it is about Turks for Americans, but you know, if you ask people the content of their stereotypes, they don't really know anything about Turkish people, right? But they really don't like them. It's interesting to me that, you know, that Asians and Jews and Germans are all persistently, well, the Germans move a little bit, but mostly in this high competence, low warmth cell. Yeah, so we can, and oh, the English, you know, they're like us, right? So, only colder. But, you know, so it turns out to be useful over time. We also had a chance to have a content analysis of a fascist magazine's descriptions of groups, because, you know, they were obsessed with social groups. And so this magazine actually had quite a few articles about different groups in the fascist era. And so Federica Durante, who visited our lab, and Chiara Valpato, worked on this meta-analysis and then used correspondence analysis to sort the groups along whatever dimensions they seem to be sortable along. And bingo, here we have the stereotype content model again. You know, Italians and Aryans are inevitably the good guys. The Jews and the English are a little scary and threatening, not nice, but threatening because they're competent. And black people and mixed race people are disgusting, which fits fascist ideology. Notice that it's a place without pity, right? So also fits. So, you know, all this descriptive stuff for me is exciting because it helps me to understand time and place. It helps me to understand the structure of the society and how these groups are treated differently. But these are all Western samples. So we thought it was important to look at the warmth by competence map in Asia, mainly because it's a favorite contrast for cultural psychologists, but also because East Asian societies tend to have a more collectivistic, interdependent orientation. On average, not everybody, but on average. So in thinking of this way, we wondered whether the model would generalize, because it might not. One possibility is that the sort of collectivity and warmth and emphasis on interpersonal harmony might expand the map in one direction and crush it in the other direction, because individual competence would be a less salient feature of social groups. Who knows? Another possibility is the fact that we keep getting all these groups in the ambivalent mixed cases. Maybe you wouldn't get that in a more homogeneous society, that particularly if it's a more hierarchical society, and that maybe these mixed groups are a result of our sort of multicultural, egalitarian, postmodern, collective, you know, politically correct values that we have to say, well, there's something good about everybody. Maybe they wouldn't be true in places that are less like that. And then the other thing we were wondering about was that much of the research on East Asian social cognition, for example, suggests that there's less narcissism, at least overt narcissism. People are less likely to say, I'm the greatest, the way Americans do, you know, quite. And so the theory in intergroup behavior is, intergroup relations, is that the reason that I hate them is because I love us. And so what if I don't admit that I love us? What if I just say we're kind of okay? Do I still find the other outgroups as useless? So we looked at 3 different samples, Japanese and Chinese, Hong Kong, and South Korean. And what you see in all 3 of these is the high part of the space is missing. Otherwise, the groups are pretty much where they always are. And this is particularly evident in the Japanese data. So the high part of the space is missing, but down here you have professionals, where we always get them. Over here you have homeless people, where they always end up, and poor people and odd jobbers and people with disabilities are sort of, elderly people are here. But notice that the groups that would be the greatest in an American sample, the in-group, Japanese people, my family, my hometown, my clubs, students, my company, full members of society, they've migrated down to this more modest, well, we're okay kind of place, but still those other groups are worse, right? It's just not that we're fabulous the way Americans talk. Okay, so some additional evidence for this in-group favoritism difference. In all the samples where we had students rating students among other people, there were 3 Western samples, and the positivity bias collapsed over warmth and competence because it's similar, is much higher in those Western samples describing students than in the 3 Asian samples describing students. So that's another way to look at the fact that there's just less in-group favoritism, but you still get these kind of nuanced prejudices. So, we're cautious about using the word universal. That's sort of, absolute, and we're not quite that absolute, but we're continuing to gather cross-cultural data from Africa and Latin America and some more Asian samples, and, provisionally, it's universal. So what I've been talking about, though, is people's theories of intergroup relations. We're asking them, how does society operate? But of course, what matters on the ground, in addition to that, is how do people treat each other as individuals? And so we decided to do a study, Anne-Marie Russell and I, where we would see whether these principles of intergroup perception operate on a one-to-one basis as well. And so we are interested in whether individual competition and status affect perceptions of individual warmth and competence. So a project team coming together, or a lab group coming together, or any department coming together, if you perceive people to have high and low status and to be competitive or cooperative, does it lead people to these kinds of inferences that we've been seeing at the societal level? So what we did was we took Princeton undergraduates and we brought them into a study where they thought they were doing a national impression formation study, and they would interact with another student. We manipulated the student's apparent background, social class in this case, and we gave them what we said was subliminal information. In fact, it wasn't, but this would give them permission to judge the other person because they thought they had information. We stole that from Vincent Iserbit in Belgium. And then we put them in a game where the payoff matrix was such that it made sense to cooperate or it made sense to compete. And we had them rate the person on warmth and competence both before they played and then after a standardized game. Basically, what you find is that the manipulation of competition and cooperation is sufficient either before they meet the person or after they've played a standardized game for them to say, this is a warm person or this is not a warm person. So it works on the interpersonal level too. Perceived competence, a high status target is seen as being more competent even before you play the game. One study used social class, another study used random boss subordinate assignment, and they still said the same thing. And it even extended to their estimates of the other person's SAT and GPA. So it wasn't just competence in this context. So, meritocracy again. Okay, I want to get to the brain data in the last 10 minutes. I have. This will be a challenge. But again, the argument is that if these are such universal fundamental dimensions, then there should be neural signatures of the kinds of reactions people have when they're looking up or looking down or interacting with somebody they expect to compete with or somebody they expect to cooperate with. And if you make the combinations, maybe these different parts of the space will have typical responses. So we're at the very early stages of this work. Lasana Harris, this is not his picture. Lasana Harris has a well-known program of research, and he's going to be talking later on as a sort of springboard from our research together, but basically looking at people's perceptions of homeless people, which I remember I said we're 3 standard deviations out from everybody else. And basically the prediction is if they are not on your side and they're also totally incompetent and sort of off scale on both those dimensions, you shouldn't have to spend any time thinking about what's in that person's mind, because basically that person doesn't matter to you. And so in effect you're dehumanizing the person. There are other kinds of people who get dehumanized, though, and I want to talk about that. And this is relevant to the Jacksonville Shipyards case that I was an expert witness in which they had soft pornography all over the place. They had pin-up pictures, they had magazines, they had everything. And one of the shipyard workers, a female person, complained about it, and they basically ignored her because they said it was trivial and didn't make any difference to how women were treated. Well, I'd like to argue that's not the case. So if you go back to the stereotype content model space, you notice that vamps are among, that is, women who are sexually dangerous, are seen as having resources that other people are interested in, but at the same time not being warm, nice, mascot-y type people. And so Mina Chikara and Jennifer Eberhard and I decided to look at this, and the hypotheses revolve around this idea that for heterosexual men, particularly sexist ones, sexualized women have instrumental value. So all the people in that high status, not warm part of the space, they have resources. Rich people have resources, right? So they have a kind of power over other people because people have an interest in what they have and they want what that person has. So it's possible that sexualized women have instrumental value, particularly for sexist men. So we predicted that they would recognize their bodies because they'd be paying attention, but they wouldn't be paying attention to their faces, which of course would individuate them. But that wasn't what the attention was about. We also, this is Jennifer's prediction, which when she told me her idea, I thought it was really gross, but that it might activate a neural network associated with motor planning and with tool use and we won't go there. And you know, if it's part of this same phenomenon, then it's then instrumental phenomenon, it should be correlated with recognition for the bodies. And finally, in a different form of dehumanization, a more sort of approach-oriented form of dehumanization, using somebody for a purpose, not as an individual, full individual, but using them for a purpose, the social cognition network might be deactivated the way it was for the homeless people, but for a different reason. And that this should be especially true of guys who are high on hostile sexism, who basically view gender relations as combative and competitive and us, them. Okay, so very quickly, what we did was brought some male students into the scanner. They saw a series of pictures of bikini-clad and fully clothed men and women, and the main dependent variables were the blood oxygen level dependent response, that is activation and various neural networks, and then this surprise recognition task afterwards where they had to recognize the faces and the bodies separately. And we also measured hostile sexism. Okay, so these are the kinds of pictures they were seeing. There were no differences in memory by condition for faces, but there were two main effects in recognition of the bodies, and you can see that because of that, the sexualized female bodies are very memorable for these guys. So that's the D prime score. Along the lines of, I don't have time to talk about everything, but D prime also correlated with activation of the thalamus, which is for the sexualized female bodies only, and it's often related to goal-directed behavior. So it's consistent with this idea that it leads to a kind of action orientation. And for those of you who've read about voodoo correlations, these are not. They're generated on part of the data and then validated on the other part of the data. And to back up this idea that some people are being kind of action-oriented toward these pictures, Mina had the idea to look at a first-person versus third-person verb IAT. So first-person verbs would be, I am intending to do something to this body, part of me is anyway, as opposed to she is doing something, right? which would be related to objectification. And so the idea was that for some of these guys, they'd be particularly oriented toward acting on this person as opposed to she's acting, right? So the IAT just says which association is faster, this or this, okay? And there's a whole series of pictures. So basically what you find is what we predicted, which is that the sexualized women, people are faster to respond to those on the I'm intending to act on type verbs. This is only true, so this is what is fast, and this is slower, and it doesn't happen for women. Okay, so that takes you out of the realm of anybody would have this reaction. Okay, then getting down to the social cognition activation or deactivation, with a whole brain analysis, you see deactivation of what is known to be a social cognition network. Look at that from the meta-analysis, not ours. So it's very much about the social cognition network, and in particular, hostile sexism within the medial prefrontal cortex, which is right there, is correlated only for the sexualized women with deactivating the part of the brain that always, 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 always comes online when you see another person, except homeless people, except apparently for sexist men, a bikini-clad woman. And again, this is not a voodoo correlation because we did it, the right way. So, and it looks more or less like this. So, what we're interested in here is these patterns that I've just described as a way to think seriously about the possibility that different kinds of prejudices would have different kinds of neural signatures. This is a different pattern than the homeless people have, but they're in a different part of the space. Nick Haslam has a wonderful theory of dehumanization where he talks about avoidance-oriented dehumanization, which would be the homeless people. Nobody wants to be contaminated by a homeless person. Versus approach-oriented dehumanization, where you want to use the person in some way, and so consequently you're not really so interested in the person with all their nuances. So not only are these two people being dehumanized, although in different ways, potentially, but, people might, under certain circumstances, want to get something from a rich, successful MBA. And so we haven't done this study yet, but it's possible that there would be a form of dehumanization that would be directed toward people with money, for example. Oh, I have my favorite charity, won't you, give money to my charity because I know you're rich and you'll feel guilty if you don't. Okay, so this is our project on the neuro side. So the takeaway point from the neuro stuff is there may be distinct regions of activation, but it's all about goals. And I see people at the table who are talking next saying, yeah, it's all about goals. I know they agree. So, okay, final point is that there are different forms of discrimination in these different parts of the space because the stereotypes are different and the relationships are different. So I don't have time to go into this in huge detail, but basically, if you look at the top half of the space, these are groups who receive active help. If you look at the bottom half of the space, these are groups who receive active harm. The right side of the space, they receive more passive help, and these guys receive more passive harm. So these are two main effects, right, of competence and warmth. What's interesting about it is what the combinations then create. So people like us get both active help and passive help. People like those horrible homeless people get excluded and ignored and demeaned, and sometimes, sadly, tragically, people attack them. Why would they want to do that? I mean, that's so sick. But so the people down here are, vulnerable to both kinds of harm. The mixed cells are interesting too. So older people, you might help somebody across the street, but you wouldn't socialize with the person. You'd rather put them in an institution, right, where they'd be socially excluded. And the rich people, you go along to get along, you shop at their stores, for example, but when the chips are down, they get active harm. And so for me, this is a description, one way of at least understanding genocide, really, you know. You have to go along with them while they're in power, but as soon as there's social breakdown, you kill them in large numbers. I don't have data on that, but I think it helps understand it. Okay. Finally, what predicts the behavior? Emotions. Emotions predict the behavior. That's the black part of these bars. Stereotypes predict just an teeny bit. But the point is that you go from social structure to the stereotypes. We saw that in the experiment, right? The stereotypes, we have mediation models I can show you, do cause these unique emotions to the different parts of the space, and those are the proximate cause of the behavior. So this is our overall theory about how all this works. It gets complicated because, you know, these are main effects, and this is an interaction because the emotions are, you know, but anyway, but that's the basic idea to take away is in terms of the sequence. So implications for you guys and what I'm assuming you're interested in. Not all biases are equivalent. In our work and in other people's work, most stereotypes are in fact ambivalent. Most of these prejudices are creating mixed emotions, and most discrimination may include both help and harm, right? Which makes it complicated to, you know, to bring to court. People don't know this. People don't know how automatic and unconscious most of this is. The brain data are one way of looking at that. They don't know how ambiguous it is and hard to detect. They don't know how ambivalent it is. So the conclusion that I draw from this is that other people, that is the organization, has to monitor what's going on. That's my bottom line from all this. Okay, thank you to all my collaborators in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere. And thank you to my lab, many of whom are here today. So I'm happy to take questions. I think we have 5 minutes for questions. Okay. Yes.
One thing that struck me is that some of the stereotypes, some of the groups that you mentioned are potentially people or potentially groups who the people in the studies could become.
Yes.
So the elderly, for example,
Right.
we are all going to become elderly.
Right.
Disabled is something that we could
Right.
potentially become
Right.
versus a different ethnicity or different gender.
Right.
I wonder if that was part of the study, if it was something that you addressed or
We've thought really hard about that because I think it's a really important dimension. And in fact, Mike North is sitting over there looking happy because he's working on ageism stereotypes precisely from that point of view, precisely the fact that it's a moving target as an outgroup. People don't expect to become disabled. I mean, in theory, you could be. But people hope and expect to get old, although you could argue that younger people at some point don't really, it's not relevant, you know. But thinking about that it doesn't make the perceptions of how they're viewed in society different. So remember, the question we're asking in many of these studies is how are these people viewed in society? Not in the brain studies and not in the interpersonal studies, but everybody knows how their group is viewed, even if it's a group they could potentially become a member of. So we get no demographic differences in people's reports of how different groups are viewed, nor do we get differences depending on whether you could become a member of that group or not. But there are really interesting dynamics around things like ageism and probably disability too that are specific. So part of what I'm arguing for is that there are principles that cut across all of these, but at the same time there are unique features of each of these kinds of outgroups that are worth examining on their own. And if you're managing an organization that has people of all these different kinds in it, you have to be sensitive to the fact that the people in the organization are going to have different experiences based on the group to which they are seen as belonging. I mean, also identity matters hugely, but just other people's perceptions of who they are, you know, will have a lot to do with the kinds of obstacles they face, and they won't all be the same. And I agree with you that this kind of moving target idea is crucial, but so far at least, the easiest way for us to think about it is to hone in on the relationships people have to that group. Yes?
What, if any, role is confirmation bias about this?
Well, I think confirmation bias, which is, for people who might not know what it is, it's I see what I expect to see, and also I bring out in other people what I expect them to be like. And so I treat them in a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of way, right? So I think somebody's going to be hostile, and so I act cool toward this person, and the person acts cool back toward me, and then it just gets worse. I think it's a general principle of stereotyping, and so I think that if you expect somebody to be warm or not warm, you can bring that about. If you expect somebody to be competent or not competent, you can kind of bring that about too if you have power over them. So I think confirmation bias is all about this, but again, it's not, I mean, many of the older studies on that were just about positive, negative, and we're being more specific about the dimensions on which you would find confirmation bias. Yes?
Is there a theory of positive surprise or negative surprise, and that is that I use it in business terms, but that you perceive, you expect someone to be one way, and they turn out to be not at all like that?
Yes.
Either positive or negative.
Yes.
I found, as a 1965 MBA, that, they expected nothing of me, but when I got the interview and did half well, they were excited, So I don't know.
Yeah, no, I am speaking about stereotypes, and going back to the continuum model that Malia mentioned, that's only the first step of impression formation, and it only works if the data more or less fit the stereotype. Assuming, well, both information and motivation drive people beyond their first impression. So these impressions of these groups, they happen in a flash of a second. People pick these up like that. I mean, we picked pictures, for example, for all these parts of the space, and people can identify them in a moment. But then it depends. It depends on whether you get additional information. It depends on whether you're motivated to pay attention to it or motivated to confirm your stereotype. People are not complete fools about this. I mean, if they see somebody completely contradicting their stereotype, they'll back off. They won't forget that the person's part of that category. So Obama is a perfect example of this. When he was first coming on the scene, people were like, who is this black man? And besides, he's sort of foreign and weird, and he's got Hussein for a middle name. And they were going kind of ballistic. And the fact that he kept on being so calm, not hostile, so competent, not stupid, not lazy, right? All the stereotypes that people could have applied to him simply were not happening. And his steadiness in continuing to be who he is eventually, I think, won him the election. That and the fact that black professionals, you may remember from some of the graphs, black professionals have started to migrate from the sort of cold but competent part of the space up into, this is the American dream. And so that's in his favor too, I think. So I think he's a perfect example of a sort of case of mass person perception, of overcoming stereotypes. But you can see from the crazy lunatic fringe, right, there are people who want to resurrect all those stereotypes, and they're having a hard time because the facts don't fit the case, but, don't underestimate the lunatic fringe. Oh, sorry.
The study of heterosexual men, for instance, the control for isn't it simply arousal? Were you able to achieve arousal without this involved hostile sexism, or was that just sort of?
Well, the fact that it correlated, many of the most interesting results correlated with hostile sexism. I mean, people did self-declare that they were heterosexual, right? So we didn't run them, or we eliminated them if they said they were gay. So the fact, I mean, you would presume that any heterosexual guy would find the picture kind of interesting, but that the hostile sexist guys in particular have a more instrumental attitude toward somebody like that. And so the fact that we get these correlations with hostile sexism in some of the areas that we're interested in, I think makes it less likely that it's about arousal. I don't know, Mina, do you have Excuse me. Do you have any thoughts about?
Just specifically that self-acceptance or negatively related to engagement of regions that are previously implicated by stereotyping and social cognitions. That was really the most interesting part, that the higher a person with possible symptoms before, the less we saw engagement of medial prefrontal cortex or stereotyping with other regions that are implicated in sexism.
So that particular finding, for example, would be hard to account for that in terms of sheer arousal. Yes.
I just want to thank you very much for this very interesting talk, and I wanted to ask you to clarify what I think was a comment you made just a little while ago that related to a question I wanted to ask. And the question is, it seems to me the model is very interesting and explains a lot, but I was wondering if you could try to apply this model to perceptions of minority groups in the United States. So, for example, to Latinos, to African Americans, put themselves in the discussed group.
Right. So let me clarify. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Related to affirmative action programs and programs for minority students, and how that ties in terms of your communications.
Okay. The first question about where do minorities place themselves, remember the question we're asking people is, how does American society view your group? And everybody knows. Everybody completely knows how their group is viewed, and they're perfectly able to report that. We did have a senior thesis student, Lyle Williams, who did do a study of black students at Princeton, perceptions of black subtypes. So that was their reporting on how the black community views each other. And that turned out to be really useful and interesting, but most of it was a sort of social class divide, the way it is in a broader sense for the white society, predominantly white society looking at black people. And so, black professionals are in a very different space from poor black people. And so black professionals are actually where women professionals are, more or less, although they're seen as nicer, that is, the black professionals. The poor blacks and the poor whites are in exactly the same place. But the black community had a more nuanced set of subtypes that they were looking at, and they spread out mostly along the status dimension, although a little bit on the warmth dimension. That's been published in a paper in the Du Bois Review, so we were able to get his thesis data into that just recently. It was about Obama, because I was. But the other part of your question about programs for minority students, I guess I would say that knowledge is power, and it's important to know how other people might be viewing you, and it's important to know how you're going to place yourself to the extent you have control over that. So to the extent that, if I had a child who was, black and going into the professions, what I would say to her is dress the part. You can't afford, and black people know this. But if you don't dress the part, then, and even if you do dress the part, some people are going to be stupid. But John Hope Franklin, who had 150 honorary degrees, was asked to carry somebody's bags in a hotel more than once, while he was standing there in his suit, So, as far as Latinos go, I think it depends on the context for Latinos. So when we ask people about Latinos generically, they end up kind of in the middle of the space. So I think it's that there are a lot of subtypes. If you look at Latinos in the immigration setting, because remember that study that I described with Tan Lee, that was about Latino immigrants. And so in that case, the news is not good, right? Because people assume that everybody's illegal and so on. But I do think that it helps to know what people might think about you so that you can disabuse them as quickly as is tactful.